There's a lot going on that's really shaking things up in the European Union right now. To kick things off, let's talk about Brussels. They just hit Elon Musk, one of America's biggest tech billionaires, with a huge fine of 120 million euros for his social media site X. That's not just pocket change, it's like a bold statement against one of the top players in the tech world. They split the fine into three big parts, starting with 45 million euros just for that paid verification system he put in place. Over in Paris, they're dealing with a budget crisis that's been brewing for decades, while Berlin is making some moves that definitely remind us of the Cold War vibe, which has led to folks protesting in the streets. And then in Washington, tensions are heating up as they're calling out some of their oldest allies for betrayal. Just when you think things couldn't get any crazier, the White House drops a document filled with some pretty inflammatory words. This is really getting experts from across the political spectrum on alert. It's all pretty wild to see how these stories connect, don't you think? Now, let me tell you why I'm chatting about this. I spent years at one of those big media outlets, the places with grand narratives that tend to twist stories to fit a certain agenda. I saw how inconvenient truths could get swept under the rug and how truth can sometimes feel negotiable. Eventually, I had to choose between staying comfy and keeping quiet or breaking free to speak my mind. I went with the latter. Now I'm independent, answering only to the truth and to you. It's definitely a tougher road, but it's the only way I can look at myself in the mirror. Before we dive in deeper, I just want to say, if you're finding this interesting and want to support journalism that stays true to the facts without bowing to corporate interests or political pressures, hitting that like button and subscribing to my channel would mean a lot. Keeping this going takes a ton of effort. Every fact gets checked and every source verified, especially with all the misinformation swirling around these days. Staying diligent requires resources, so if you can, think about sponsoring this channel. It's really more than just support. It's an investment in journalism that puts truth first. You'll definitely want to hang on until the end of this episode because what I'm about to share is really going to change how you see the whole situation. Let's jump right into what's been going on in the worlds of tech and politics. It's really quite something how verifying real accounts has turned into a total commercial mess. We're looking at fines totaling $35 million for advertising violations and another $40 million for restricting researchers' access to public data. This whole investigation has been going on for 2 years, all under the Revolutionary Digital Services Act, which was set up to make sure that big tech actually protects European users from fraud and harmful content. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Elon Musk didn't shy away from his reactions. He responded quickly and quite dramatically. It got even more intense when US Vice President J.D. Vance joined the fray, supporting Musk and arguing that the European Union should be defending free speech instead of targeting American companies. Musk was really appreciative of that support and hinted at possible consequences for officials in Brussels. With Donald Trump back in the political scene, this conflict is cranking up even more. His administration has made it clear they're ready to hit back hard at any sanctions against American tech companies. It's worth considering what that blue check mark once stood for. It used to be free and just meant that you were who you said you were. But now, it's going to cost you €7 a month. Verification has really turned into something you can buy, and that has completely shaken people's trust in the platform. Meanwhile, while Brussels is tangled up in its issues with Silicon Valley, Paris is dealing with a crisis of its own that's even more urgent and severe. France is in the midst of a budget disaster, the likes of which we haven't seen since the oil crisis of the 1970s. For the first time in 45 years, the country will end this year without an approved budget for the upcoming period. That's a pretty big deal. It's a significant hit to the political credibility of the Eurozone's second largest economy. To tackle this, President Emmanuel Macron is resorting to a special law, which is basically his last option according to the Constitution. So here's the deal with this new law in France. It's going to freeze government spending and taxes at last year's levels. What does this really mean? Well, it means that government ministries can't launch any new programs and services will be just scraping by, stuck in survival mode. The entire French government is basically running on emergency power now, which is quite a situation for one of the world's top democracies. It's a bit of a head-scratcher when you think about all the tangled political issues at play. Let's unpack the political scene in France a bit. Former Prime Minister Edouard Philippe, who was once a close ally of President Macron, has suddenly turned his back on the government. It's almost like he's thrown a wrench into their budget plan. Philippe stated that Macron has effectively killed off the majority, which is not a good look. and he's calling for early elections because he felt the president didn't bother to consult anyone before dissolving parliament. Meanwhile, the National Assembly got into a real tussle over the budget proposal from Prime Minister Michel Barnier. She had warned that if this budget doesn't pass, around 18 million French citizens would face automatic tax hikes. Macron promised to protect everyone from that situation with a new budget set for early next year. But honestly, whether a new government can be formed is still up in the air. Now, here's the kicker. The truth is that this special law isn't fixing anything. It's more like putting a Band-Aid on a serious wound. Véronique Louvagie, the vice president of the National Assembly's Finance Committee, warned that while this shaky arrangement might stave off disaster until August or September, it won't hold much longer. Afterwards, the state will be squeezed between stagnant revenues and rising costs, especially regarding public sector wages and paying off debts. Senator Jean-François Husson even called this special law the smartest move to cool things down, understanding that after such a significant no-confidence vote, you can't just throw on some quick fixes. France isn't just dealing with a budgeting crisis, it's watching its political machinery start to stall. Now, if that sounds concerning, check this out. Germany just made a big move that has sent shockwaves across Europe. While France is caught in a political quagmire, Germany is bringing back military conscription. So recently, the Bundestag made a pretty big decision by passing a law that brings back compulsory military service. They had 323 votes in favor, 272 against, and just one person chose to abstain. This change is quite a turnaround for Germany, especially since they got rid of mandatory service back in 2011 after reunification. Young people are really reacting strongly to this shift. Protests have been popping up in over 80 cities, including places like Berlin, Cologne, and Kassel. Many demonstrators are claiming that the government is pushing a militarized agenda and moving away from the peaceful values that have shaped Germany since the war. It's interesting to think about, as a whole generation has been raised with the belief that that era is behind them. Now, Germany has big plans to enlarge its military, aiming to increase the size of the Bundeswehr to 260,000 service members by the year 2035. That's quite a jump from the current 180,000, plus they have about 200,000 reservists. While they're not immediately making military service mandatory, they are trying to entice volunteers. They're even planning to bump up the starting pay to 6,300 euros a month, which is 450 euros more than what new recruits make right now. But here's the twist. If voluntary recruitment doesn't work out, the government could potentially reinstate conscription if they get the go-ahead from Parliament. Starting next year, all 18-year-olds will be receiving a questionnaire to see how many are willing to serve, but it's important to note that only men are expected to fill it out. By July 2027, young men will also need to undergo a military medical exam once they reach adulthood. This shift in Berlin is really changing how Europe thinks about security. The Defense Ministry will now have to report recruitment stats to Parliament every 6 months, and if they're not hitting their targets, there could be random selection for conscription. Experts are connecting this change to a growing realization that Europe can't keep leaning on the American military for protection anymore. With the rising tensions with Russia, uncertainty in American policies, and a push for Europe to be more independent, it looks like countries in Europe are finally gearing up to strengthen their military capabilities for the first time in decades since the end of the Cold War. Germany, a nation that prided itself on peace and moving on from World War II, seems to be entering a new chapter. You see young people rallying in the streets, and it's clear they're catching on to the message from their government. Peace isn't something we can just assume will stick around. Now, here's a twist in the story. While Europe is anxiously working to shore up its defenses, they get a surprise from the White House. At a NATO meeting for foreign ministers, Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau didn't hold back as he called out European allies for ignoring American defense companies when making military purchases. He pushed for fair access to their markets for American firms, suggesting that European nations are being too protective, which could jeopardize everyone's security. Another official from the State Department chimed in that Europe needs to turn those defense budget promises into real capabilities instead of getting stuck in protectionist ways. It's pretty striking how, while the US lectures Europe about protectionism, the irony is hard to miss. The US has its own protectionist practices with military procurement, like the Buy American rules and the Berry Amendment, which keep foreign suppliers from getting their foot in the door for Pentagon contracts, even if European products might actually be better. And on the topic of defense, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte recently pushed for allies to set aside at least $1 billion a month to buy American weapons for Ukraine. That's quite a hefty request. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio hasn't been showing up to meetings, something that hasn't happened in more than 20 years, and European diplomats are feeling this as a rather rude snub. Now, bear with me because here's where things get really pointed. The US is calling out Europe for not spending enough, while in fact European countries are actually ramping up their defense budgets to meet the US demand of hitting 2% of GDP for NATO. It's as if Washington is saying, sure, boost your defense budget, but make sure that money's flowing to us and not your own companies. Now, let's take a closer look at all this. So, there's this fresh document that came out from the White House, a hefty 33 pages that outlines their national security strategy. Interestingly, it claims that mass migration could threaten the very fabric of Western civilization. Trump even went as far as to say that if Europe doesn't get a grip on migration from developing countries soon, it could be staring down a pretty bleak future with the potential for civilizational extinction within the next 20 years. His plan? He wants to stop all migration from third world countries to let the American system recover fully. Now, Homeland Security Secretary Christine Noem has hinted at even expanding the list of countries subject to bans, swinging it up to over 30. That's quite a leap from the 12 countries that are fully banned right now and 7 that face partial restrictions. The language in this document is raising some serious alarms, feeling eerily similar to that controversial idea called the Great Replacement Theory, which suggests that white populations in the West are being replaced by non-white migrants. Trump has thrown a lot of blame on migration for all sorts of problems: censorship, low birth rates, economic struggles, and a decline in culture. He's even promised to cut federal aid and benefits for non-citizens, strip status from migrants he considers threats to domestic peace, and deport any foreigner he sees as a burden or a security risk. It's honestly hard to believe he said that out loud. The atmosphere right now is really tense, and it's concerning how the conversations happening at the top seem to legitimize xenophobia and racial hatred. This isn't just about policies. It's about ideologies that have led to some pretty dark chapters in history. We really need to unpack what all of this means. Let's break it down. We're facing 5 major crises that aren't just random events. They're part of a larger picture that's shifting the dynamics between the US and Europe. For example, there's a digital conflict heating up between Brussels and Silicon Valley, financial issues in France, Germany's ramping up its defense, accusations of protectionism from the US, and a surge of anti-migration rhetoric coming from the White House. In short, Europe is trying to carve out its own strategic independence, regulate these tech giants, boost its defenses, and protect its economic interests, while America is calling the shots and expecting its allies to follow suit. Right now, we're in a pretty wild spot, and it's all happening right in front of us. It's a little unsettling, to be honest. Look at France. They're having a tough time getting a budget approved. And over in Germany, conscription is making a comeback, which feels like a big step backward. The European Union is even threatening to hit American companies with massive fines. Hundreds of millions of dollars are on the line. Meanwhile, the White House is tossing around phrases like civilizational extinction. It's clear that this situation isn't typical, and it definitely can't last. There's a real contradiction going on. European countries are stepping up their defense spending, just like they were asked, but then the folks in Washington complain that they aren't buying enough American products. Europe is also facing demographic and economic pressures that call for immigration, but the White House is treating that as some sort of existential threat. Every move Europe makes to claim some independence gets interpreted as a betrayal, while America's demands are wrapped up in this idea of sticking together as allies. This isn't how partnerships are supposed to work. It feels more like how empires deal with their colonies, and the stakes here are rising even higher. The Western Alliance, which played a crucial role in winning both World War II and the Cold War, is based on a straightforward deal. America provides security and Europe brings legitimacy and shared values to the table. So what's going to happen if America starts wanting security without giving anything in return, all while pushing for maximum economic gain? And what if our shared values start to drift apart on critical issues like migration, tech regulation, and the norms of democracy? If this alliance starts to feel more like extortion than a mutual partnership, we could be in for some serious problems. The alliance that held the global framework for about 70 years is really feeling the pressure, and it wasn't built to withstand this kind of strain. We're caught up in a mix of populism, nationalism, and economic rivalry among supposed allies, all while grappling with vastly different ideas about what the West should represent. Cracks are appearing everywhere, and they're getting deeper by the day. The big question is whether those at the top have the wisdom and courage to fix things before it all falls apart. So let's take a closer look at what's been going on. Brussels has really taken a bold step by going after American tech giants with some serious regulations. Meanwhile, France is caught up in a constitutional mess, struggling even to get a simple budget passed. Germany is shifting gears too, moving away from its long-standing post-war pacifism and starting to think about mass mobilization again. Over in Washington, there's a lot of finger-pointing at allies for being protectionist, while they're ramping up their own protectionist actions even more. And it gets weirder with a presidential security document that oddly frames human migration as some kind of civilizational warfare. Each of these happenings is significant on its own, but together they paint a picture of a partnership that's really starting to fray. What's happening isn't the kind of split people expected. Instead, it's a tug of war between sovereignty and submission. Europe is trying to carve out its own space on the global stage, aiming for its own set of rules, military capabilities, and economic ambitions. In contrast, the current leadership in the United States sees this push as defiance rather than progress, which has only ramped up tensions and created some resentment. What was once an equal partnership is turning into something that feels more like a protection racket. Historically, major alliances don't often fall apart with dramatic betrayals. It's usually more about a buildup of grievances, tiny betrayals stacking up over time until it dawns on everyone that the partnership just isn't working out for all parties involved anymore. That's the path we seem to be on right now. If you found my take on this helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could share it around. And if you're enjoying what I bring to the table, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who could use the real deal behind all the headlines. Plus, if you believe in independent journalism focused on sticking to the facts, no matter the political or corporate pressures, consider becoming a sponsor. What we do truly matters, believe me. Each episode requires a ton of research, fact-checking, and digging deep. We're dedicated to uncovering the truth because it's important to have champions who aren't swayed by big corporations or political agendas. Your support makes all this possible. The most intriguing developments often connect the dots that mainstream media ignores. It's essential to stay informed, critical, and engaged, especially since what comes next depends on whether people really grasp what's at stake before it's too late. We're navigating some pretty significant territory here, and if you're following along, it's clear you get just how important these events are. The major media companies, they tend to skip the deeper connections because their focus is more on stirring up a quick outrage to sell some ads. But digging into the nitty-gritty, like complex security protocols, checking budget laws in Paris, and looking into defense contracts, that's no easy feat and definitely not glamorous. It really does feel like an ongoing struggle against a wave of misinformation and custom narratives. I made the choice to leave behind the cozy security of a corporate paycheck because I refuse to follow someone else's script that overlooks the truth. But I won't lie, that freedom comes with its own challenges. Since we're not bankrolled by billionaires, our work relies entirely on your support. If you value a voice that stands firm and won't just go along with the crowd, I'd really appreciate you considering sponsoring the channel. It's not just a donation, it's like offering a supportive handshake, a way of saying you prefer facts over falsehoods. Your help lets us keep up the important work of verifying information for you so you don't have to do all that heavy lifting. So if you can, give that like button a click, subscribe, and think about joining me as a sponsor. Together, we can keep this beacon of truth shining. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.